What is meant by generosity and how is it presented in Charles Dickens' novella A Christmas Carol? Let's find out.
How's it going, Revision Squad? It's me, Liam, aka Mr. Knight, aka DystopiaJunkie, and in this video we are going to think about how the theme of generosity is presented in Charles Dickens' novella A Christmas Carol, which we are going to do by looking at some key contextual information and reading and analysing some relevant quotations. My hope for this video is that something I say or write will help you out as you study or revise Dickens' classic Christmas tale. As per usual, I strongly suggest that you've got a pen and some paper in front of you as you watch this video, so that you can make some notes of the ideas that we go over. Also, if you find this video to be helpful in any way, please do consider dropping it a like, writing me a comment, sharing it with anyone who might find it useful, and of course, subscribing to my channel if you aren't already. In fact, YouTube tells me that almost 80% of you who are watching my videos aren't actually subbed up. And you wouldn't believe how much it would help me if we could have more of you subscribed. Now, helping me out also means that I can continue to help you out as well. So really, it's a win-win situation. Okay, so I've said that this video is going to be about generosity, but what exactly do I mean by that? Or rather, what might an examiner be looking for when marking an exam paper that's about generosity? Now, the most obvious approach to take here is to think about generosity in financial terms, looking at acts of charity and financial support and how they, and the characters involved in them, are presented throughout the story. Now, that's one approach to take, and although it is the most literal interpretation of this theme, that won't stop you from achieving those top grades. But here's the thing, generosity can be more than just a money-based thing. It's also possible to be generous with other things, such as our time, support, and love. As long as we are freely giving to those less fortunate than us, we are behaving in a generous way. Now, I mention this because having a consideration of non-financial generosity could really bolster an essay and show that generosity isn't just something that is restricted to the financially wealthy. Finally, I would just like to mention that if you are given a question about generosity, you can of course talk about its opposite, so greed and selfishness, as long as you remember to frame those things as the lack of generosity. Now, you can do this with pretty much any theme for almost any text. If asked about love, you could also discuss hate. If asked about conflict, you could talk about peace. If asked about fate, you could talk about freedom or free will. If the quotations are there to support you and you've got the argumentative capabilities in hand, go for it. Be brave, be bold, and take risks. As long as you can support your ideas well, sensible ideas that is, ones that aren't silly and have not misunderstood the literal meanings of words, nobody can really call your literary analysis wrong. It's just different. Anyway, if the theme of generosity looks at acts of giving in terms of money, but also time and support and whatnot, or the absence of them, which quotations can we discuss in relation to its presentation in A Christmas Carol? Well, before we do that, we've got some all-important context to look at. Right, context, let's go. Remember, most GCSE exam boards require you to apply the historical, social, or political backgrounds of your Victorian texts to your analysis of them. If you don't do this, you're likely to miss out on an awful lot of marks, even if your actual analysis and discussion of the text is pretty spot on. So first of all, I would like to acknowledge that there were charities in the Victorian era, but that they were no way near as formalised as they are today. By that, I mean that charities were much smaller in their scope. They may only have covered a town or borough, for instance, or only gave support to certain groups of people. Furthermore, they depended on donations from wealthy individuals, rather than centralised support from the government or other means, in order to run. This meant that their funds would have been smaller, of course. Now, because the charities were smaller and had less money, they were ultimately less effective. Now, it has been suggested by some critics that individuals were able to take advantage of how small and disconnected these charities were, and claim support from more than one of them. Although this meant that some individuals were able to maybe get the full support they actually needed, it also meant that the charity's resources could not spread as far, making them more ineffective. Now, charities were based in lots of different locations, but it should be said that churches were often hubs of charitable activity. Now, this was because generosity, particularly financial generosity, had strong ties with Christianity. For some, charity was seen as a way of saving one's soul while also supporting those in need, whereas for others, they believed that by coming into contact with human nature, particularly with those in need, they were able to come in contact with Christ. Add into this the idea that helping the poor was equitable to helping one's own family, for Christians believe that everybody is a child of God, and it's easy to see why charity and Christianity were so strongly connected in the Victorian times. Simply put, being charitable meant being a good Christian. Now, charities did have some links to education too. Not all charities believed in just handing out money to the poor, and instead felt that if they educated the poor instead, teaching them how to live better lives, they could help them in a more permanent, effective way. Now, I'm sure you've heard about ragged schools at some point in your study of Victorian literature. In short, they were free schools set up by wealthy benefactors to give poor children an education, which in turn, it was hoped, would improve their quality of life. Although we don't really see a ragged school in action in A Christmas Carol, it is generally believed that Dickens's visit to a ragged school in 1843 was something that motivated him to write A Christmas Carol, as he was so appalled by the conditions that the poor were subjected to. The idea of education may also be particularly relevant to the entity known as ignorance, as a better quality of education would do a lot to diminish the levels of so-called ignorance among the working classes. Finally, and this is a super quick comment, Dickens himself was a notable Victorian philanthropist. This meant that he was a high-profile example of a wealthy person who used his money and resources to help those who were less fortunate than he was. Perhaps this was another reason why he was motivated to write A Christmas Carol, because as much as he was trying to do what he could to assist the poor, he was only one man, and one man's generosity does not solve poverty on its own. Dickens was aware that in order to help out the working class en masse, the middle and upper classes had to get an awful lot more generous. Hopefully this has given you a good understanding of what it meant to be generous in the Victorian times. But now, which quotations could we use in order to analyse its depiction in Dickens's story? Let's dive in. As I'm sure you know by now, if you've watched any of my other videos about A Christmas Carol, all the page references I will be making in this video refer to this copy of the book. So if you have a different copy, they will probably be different. Hopefully though, I still make it pretty clear whereabouts in the story they come from. So the first quotation I want to think about in terms of generosity, or in this case the lack of it, comes from Scrooge in Stave 1 when he talks to the charity representative. He says, and I'm sure you're pretty familiar with this quotation by now, "If they would rather die," said Scrooge, "they'd better do it and decrease the surplus population." With the theme of generosity in mind, I would say that this quotation shows that Scrooge is so selfish that he hoards his wealth, even though he knows that doing so will cost other people their lives. This is clear, I think, in how he asserts that the poor had better do it, meaning of course die, which is more preferable to Scrooge than him donating some of his vast wealth. You could also argue that this quotation shows Scrooge not only being financially ungenerous, but also emotionally ungenerous too, because he is not showing any sympathy whatsoever to those who are in need. All of this, I'm sure you would agree, presents Scrooge in a pretty negative light. Could this be Dickens's way of encouraging his readers to behave in less selfish ways. Interestingly, our second quotation comes from the ghost of Jacob Marley, which of course means that it can be found at the end of stave 1. Now Marley says, "I am here tonight to warn you that you have yet a chance and hope of escaping my fate, a chance and hope of my procuring Ebenezer." Now you're probably sat there thinking, how does this show generosity? Well, I would argue that this quotation shows Marley displaying a degree of generosity towards Scrooge because he is giving the miser a chance to avoid Marley's fate. Now the reason why I think this is because when Marley tells Scrooge that he has a chance and hope of escaping my fate, he then adds that this chance and hope were of his procuring. The verb procuring means creation or obtaining, whereas the possessive pronoun my makes it clear that it was Marley who did the creation or obtaining. What all this means then is that Marley has chosen to go to the effort of giving Scrooge the chance to redeem himself in the hope that this will allow the miser to avoid the ghost's fate. Now this is pretty generous and thoughtful, I reckon, because Marley's ghost has gone out of its way to support Scrooge. This does make me wonder though, did Marley learn the importance of generosity too late? It seems likely, doesn't it? Perhaps if he was more generous in life, he too would have been able to avoid the hellish existence he is now destined to forever lead. Quotation number 3 takes us to stave 2. In particular, I want us to look at the Ghost of Christmas Past's dialogue that is made in reference to Fezziwig, Scrooge's former employer. At the end of the party that Fezziwig throws for his employees, friends and neighbours, the spirit observes, "A small matter to make these silly folks so full of gratitude. He has spent but a few pounds of your mortal money, 3 or 4 perhaps." Now what I'm going to say here is pretty similar to what I said in my analysis of this quotation in my wealth and poverty video, which is that Fezziwig provides Scrooge with an example of how small acts of generosity can have an enormous positive impact on people. We get the idea that Fezziwig's act of generosity is small, by which I mean that it did not cost him an awful lot, because the spirit uses the modifier "but a few" to create the impression that the pounds that Fezziwig spends, estimated to be 3 or 4, is not a large sum of money for him to spend at all. In fact, this amount equates to roughly £200 in today's money, which isn't really all that much for a business owner to spend on a Christmas party. Now we know that Fezziwig has behaved in a generous way, using a tiny amount of his wealth on others. But how do we know that it has had an enormous positive impact? Well, the spirit's use of the emphatic phrase, "so full of gratitude," makes that pretty clear to me, because not only are the partygoers thankful for what the business owner has done for them, but their gratefulness is practically bursting out of them, because that's how full of thanks they are. Stave 3 is where we're going to find our fourth quotation. In particular, we can locate it in the narration of Scrooge and the Ghost of Christmas Present as they wander about the streets of London on Christmas Day. In the narration, we find out, "The sight of these poor revellers appeared to interest the spirit very much, for he sprinkled incense on their dinners from his torch." Now to me, this shows that the Ghost of Christmas Present is especially generous towards the poor, doing what he can to improve their days. The reason why I think this is because he is shown to be sprinkling incense from his torch onto their Christmas dinners, an act that seems to improve the moods of the poor. The spirit doesn't actually have to do this. He is invisible to everyone but Scrooge, and so he cannot be thanked for his good deeds. This is what makes him generous. He does good things, especially to the less advantaged, fully in the knowledge that he will not get anything in return for it. Simply put, that's charity. Still in stave 3, I would like to spend a moment looking at Tiny Tim's dialogue during the Cratchit Christmas dinner, for a type of generosity can be seen there. As they toast their meal, Tiny Tim erupts with a "God bless us, everyone." Now you might think it's a bit odd for me to talk about how a poor character is being generous. After all, the Cratchits don't have loads of money, do they? And you're not wrong, but as I said earlier, generosity doesn't just have to be about giving people money or other goods. You see, I reckon this quotation shows Tiny Tim being generous because he is being thoughtful towards everyone in asking for God's blessings to apply to them, rather than only just his family. This level of thoughtfulness is generous because Tiny Tim does not seek to gain anything in being selfless. He just wants everyone else to live as best a life as possible, and is trying to do what little he can to ensure that this happens. If you've watched all of my videos in this series so far, you'll probably have noticed that I've mentioned this quotation in quite a few of them, which might suggest to you that this is a pretty good quotation to remember, as it can be used in loads of different essays. We're staying in stave 3 for quotation number 6. If you turn to the end of the stave, in which Scrooge has been introduced to the figures of ignorance and want, you will notice that the miser asks, "Have they no refuge or resource?" cried Scrooge. In asking this question at all, we can see that Scrooge's thoughts are becoming increasingly generous, because by asking if ignorance and want have any refuge or resource, he shows that he is aware that the wealthy should feel obligated to support the less fortunate. Furthermore, because the verb used to describe Scrooge's dialogue is cried, you could even argue that Scrooge feels that the needs of ignorance and want demand immediate attention, given his heightened emotional state, or that he is shocked by, and perhaps then also sympathetic towards, the impoverished state of the two monstrous entities. This shows, I reckon, that Scrooge actually sort of cares about ignorance and want, showing a level of emotional generosity that he did not display at the start of the story. Of course, Scrooge's question is also used to achieve another effect. Written in the story like this, it is bound to have made some of Dickens's readers ask a similar question. Is there any refuge or resource for ignorance and want? And so it sort of functions in a similar way to a rhetorical question. This is Dickens's way, I think, of inviting his readers to ask if there really is enough support for the poor. I hope it's pretty clear that the answer to that question would be a resounding no. And so by having Scrooge ask this question, Dickens is encouraging his readers to realise that more needs to be done to support the less fortunate. We're only going to focus on one quotation from stave 4, and it's one that relates to Fred. Hidden among all the sadness related to Tiny Tim's death, Bob Cratchit recalls something said by Scrooge's nephew in response to the news, which is, "If I can be of service to you in any way," he said, giving me his card, "that's where I live. Pray, come to me." Fred's generosity is evident in this quotation, I think, because he offers support to the Cratchits, despite the fact that he doesn't actually know them all that well. The adverbial "in any way" suggests that Fred is willing to support the Cratchits however they want, whether that be financial, emotional, or in relation to their employment, as we see later on when the Cratchits excitedly joke about Fred getting Peter a better situation, which means job in that context. The fact that Fred invites Bob to come to his house whenever he needs also shows a level of compassion and emotional generosity too. Now Fred is offering all of this despite the fact that he barely knows the Cratchits, which is revealed earlier in the scene as it is written in the narration that Bob had scarcely seen Fred but once before. And furthermore, Fred's not really going to gain much in return for helping them out, apart from maybe a nice warm fuzzy feeling. As such, his gesture is utterly selfless, a true act of generosity. And to end, I want to look at a trio of quotations from stave 5, all relating to Scrooge in some way. The first, about halfway through the stave, can be found in the narration. It is, the chuckle with which he paid for the turkey, and the chuckle with which he paid for the cab, and the chuckle with which he recompensed the boy. Second, we have Scrooge's dialogue when he speaks with the charity representative. After pledging to donate what we can only assume to be a large sum of money, Scrooge says, "A great many back payments are included in it, I assure you." And last of all, when in conversation with Bob Cratchit towards the end of the story, Scrooge says, "I'll raise your salary and endeavour to assist your struggling family." Now, all of these quotations, I'm sure you'll agree, make it pretty clear that, by the end of the story, Scrooge is transformed into a generous individual, but not only one who is generous in financial terms. The first quotation features a list of 3 references to Scrooge paying somebody, as seen by the 2 uses of paid and then also the verb recompensed. And each of these references are attached to the noun chuckle, showing not only that Scrooge is being generous, but that he is happy to do so. Indeed, generosity seems to bring the former miser great joy. The second quotation hints at the enormity of Scrooge's newfound generosity, because the back payments that are included in his charity donation are modified by the phrase "great many," which, put together, emphasise the idea that Scrooge is donating an incredible sum of money to the charity. Many back payments would be generous, as would great back payments, but putting them both together really suggests the vastness of the sum that Scrooge is offering. In the third quotation, we see how Scrooge's generosity is not just financial. The verb raise makes it pretty clear that Scrooge is going to start to pay Bob more, which arguably is not all that generous, as he may have been underpaying his clerk for quite some time. However, it is the verb chain endeavour to assist that reveals the true extent of Scrooge's generosity. You see, the verb endeavour means to try, but to try really, really hard. As such, we get the impression that Scrooge is going to do everything he can to help the Cratchits out, not only pay Bob more, showing a degree of generosity and selflessness that would have been unimaginable for him to show at the beginning of the novella. Right, that's the quotation analysis done, but that doesn't mean that the video is over. We still have a summary, question, further ideas and other recommendations to still talk about, all of which, I hope, will assist you in analysing this text to a super high standard. So, if we wanted to summarise how the theme of generosity is presented in this novella, what could we say? Well, we could say, as a socially conscious writer, Dickens stresses the importance of being a generous individual throughout his novella. He demonstrates that generosity is not only a financial obligation, but is something that should permeate all aspects of how people treat each other. Generous characters such as Fred, Fezziwig and Tiny Tim are celebrated throughout the story, whereas selfish attitudes, which are most evident in Scrooge in the first half of the story, are demonised. As such, Dickens encourages his readers to behave in more generous ways, particularly to the less fortunate. Now, this summary is helpful because it includes Dickens's likely intention, shows a clear argument, aka generosity is good, selfishness bad, and also includes that more perceptive comment that generosity should not just be a financial consideration. In naming several characters, the summary also sets up a number of analytical paragraphs, which might help you to kickstart an essay. If you think that summary is going to help you out in some way, now's your last chance to pause the video and copy it down, as we're about to move on. So I promised you a question, further ideas and extra recommendations, and so here they are. First, that question. Out of all the characters in A Christmas Carol, who would you say is the most generous and why? Now, you're free to do whatever you want with this question. You could use it to prompt a mind map, a debate with your friends if you are revising together, or even a shortish evaluative essay in which you weigh up the relative levels of generosity between various characters. Hey, you could even write an evaluative paragraph for me down in the comments section. If you do, I'll make sure to reply with some informal feedback, which might help you to think all the more deeply about this theme. If you don't fancy doing anything with that question, why not use the following questions instead to prompt some additional ideas? After all, do any other characters demonstrate selfishness other than Scrooge? Bringing in other characters to the selfish side, even if they are minor characters, might allow you to make a more nuanced and perceptive argument, which will only help you to gain extra marks. Furthermore, do the generous characters, such as Fred, Fezziwig, or some of the spirits, display their generosity in quotations other than the ones I've discussed in this video? For the sake of trying to cover as many characters as possible, I've only really given each character one quotation, and I know, because I've still got loads of extra notes, that their generous attitudes are evident in more quotations than the ones that I've discussed in this video. If you don't want to do much more in the way of thinking and just want to watch another video or read some additional sources, then please do have a look at my video about the theme of wealth and poverty. The theme of generosity has considerable overlap with that theme, and so you might be able to gain some additional insight into the importance of generosity by watching that video. Additionally, please do check out my bibliography down in the video description, which contains a bunch of resources that you might find useful to read if you're after some additional contextual information. Blimey, I've offered you quite a bit there, haven't I? You could even say that I've been generous in supplying you of that much. Alright, terrible pun over. I can safely say that that is the end of my discussion of the theme of generosity in A Christmas Carol. Honestly, I hope this video has been helpful in some way. Whether you're revising for exams, just trying to understand Dickens' story better, or, and this will date this video, stuck at home doing some lockdown learning. If this has been helpful at all and you would like to make your appreciation known, a like, comment, subscription or share would be immensely appreciated. It helps me out loads and helps me to help even more young people with their studies, and so it's a win-win situation for everyone. Anyway, as ever, I hope that you have an awesome rest of the day. If you are revising, please do remember to take frequent short breaks, as a burned out student is not a happy or successful student, which is what I think you deserve to be.
So as well as being a financial obligation, generosity, for Dickens, is something that can be seen in our actions and thoughts as well. Characters such as Fezziwig, Fred, Tiny Tim and the Spirits all display different types of generosity, and Scrooge, who is the most selfish, ungenerous character at the beginning of the story, comes to embody all aspects of generosity by its end.